All right, and we're live. Welcome everybody to this remote interview. My name is Lisette and I'm interviewing people and companies doing great things remotely. And today on the line, I have Nadia Fatalidis. I had written that down incorrectly. Nadia, thank you so much. We are talking about the head of remote position, which is something new and emerging. So I want to just start out really quickly with what is a head of remote, in your opinion?
Amazing. So great to connect, Lizette. A head of remote, I think, has replaced your very traditional operations function or process function. So if you imagine a role that literally orchestrates how a company should be operating, right? And so traditionally, I think we all might have had a chief operating officer that sets the boundaries of how things run in an organization day to day. I think a head of remote is replacing that in companies that works remotely by design.
Is there room for both?
Great question. Yeah. Yes. I'll start by saying yes. And I will also say this function has so many components to it in a remote or hybrid organization that the workload deserves to have a maybe a department or division on its own, right? It does work across so many different teams and probably the entire company, right? But I think putting it under a different function, like, for example, people and culture or internal comms or ops, does nearly filter it down a little bit too much. The importance of this function does literally decide how the organization is going to optimize the working model, right? And the operating model that the company is in. And that helps set global boundaries or whatever the case might be. I think this function is in 2024 onwards, and I would even say prior, is a function on its own. Atlassian does such a good job of that. And so I've been following their journey with Head of Remote for a while now. And I think they realized probably during the pandemic, if not prior, the importance of this function and the creative role it plays in the future of work.
What do you see as the specific responsibilities of this role? I mean, we've said broadly, like setting the processes, but like, what does that actually mean?
Great question. To me, it's about figuring out if you're working at a tech SaaS startup, right? And there's these amazing co-founders that has this vision for a company, and one of those components is remote work. That does become an operating structure. It's not necessarily a benefit, right? It is the way the company is operating globally. And so I think I would start very holistically with that. If co-founders or even a private corporate company that's post-IPO decides to run their organization remotely, that is their operating method. And so the responsibilities are so vast when it comes to just thinking about what an operating model takes. For me, there's so many components of that. It can be things like if you're using company values, this head of remote would take those values and operationalize it in every single element of the company. So if you imagine in remote work, asynchronous communication is a core component, right? Especially if you have the intersection of time zones or global cultures, or, I mean, it becomes very complicated very quickly, where you don't necessarily have working hours, you have flexibility. Asynchronous communication becomes a big component of that remote working structure. And so a head of remote would do anything and everything from figuring out how to operationalize those values to elevating the way folks are communicating with each other asynchronously. And that also means partnering with an internal and external comms team, right? So I think it becomes the function that is literally responsible for all elements of the operating model of the company and all the intersection that that touches. If you can imagine, there might be documentation, a global handbook, right? Internal or open source, transparently facing. All of those components start becoming part and parcel of this function. It does start with things like values or operating principles. Many companies call it many different things, so it really depends on how they've started that. But it starts with operationalizing that and then building on that. How are people going to communicate with each other? How are they going to collaborate on projects? What tools are they going to be using? And to me personally, if you have a head of remote function, I do think it becomes your efficiency hack. It becomes your number one role that's going to ensure the company is operating in a productive way. Your chief operating officer, right, their role might be evolving and changing towards things like digging into how they support the rest of the company, like revenue operations or sales operations or sales enablement. It could also be how business operations works, right? And that's more on the tech ops, like the IT front. I don't think head of remote's responsible for that. I think they're in collaboration with those teams. But I think to me, it is really setting the boundaries of how you're going to be working day to day. And there's so many things that touches that.
How much needs to be done from a company perspective versus the team? Like how top down does it need to be? Because at some point like the team needs to just decide how they work together, and at some point you have to work within another structure. So where's that balance?
Good question. I think a head of remote and their function are the enablers, right? They set the guidelines, right? But with flexibility in mind, not every specific way of work is going to work for every team. I think if there are bad habits, meaning there are specific teams in the company that's really struggling with asynchronous communication, there's an opportunity for the head of the remote to host a work session or a brainstorming session with that particular team and elevating how to operate asynchronously, right? For their own best will, for their opportunity to create more accessibility for their whole team across time zones, or for them to have better communication with each other and optimization of the tools that the company is using. But I think it's more an enablement function. It's a function that enables the organization to operate in this way with flexibility in mind. So not every team is going to love working in that way. For example, a support engineering team that is supporting customers in a sync way, right? Their hours might have to be fixed. Their availability might need to be quite specific based on customer needs. Whereas a team like a coordination team for talent acquisition is more of a back end function, right? And more operating in the back end to orchestrate all the different things that candidates is going to experience, right? They might not need to work specific time zones. Their availability might be a lot more flexible than someone, for example, in a support engineering function. So I do think it depends on the team. And I think there are ways to enable that as well through a head of remote. But I think it's about creating really good guidelines and enablement, and the teams being directly responsible for how they're going to live that out day to day.
Right. So you're supporting team success through whatever that team needs. Some teams are rocking asynchronous, other teams are having trouble with team building, other teams just having an agreement together. I can see that. So then in terms of essential skills for somebody who's under head of remote, I mean, not everybody can do this. So what are some of the things that you have to be good at in order to take on this job?
Great question. I think resilience, whether that's a competency or grit, so one of those, definitely. I think that is a necessary competency that you need to have. And then from a skills perspective, probably the ability to adapt to constant change. This is not a function where you're going to create a playbook and then it stays the same. This is where continuous improvement, iteration, piloting, new ideas, using very creative methods are going to continuously show up. If you remember, I don't know if you ever watched the sitcom Friends, where Ross, the one individual, was going up a bunch of stairs and he had a couch or a mattress and he kept shouting at the other person, which I think was Rachel at the time, pivot, like he kept shouting, pivot, pivot. I think this role is that, right? You are going to continuously have to pivot through the organizational stages. At some point, there will also be leadership changes that has strong opinions on how the company is operating in a remote fashion. And again, whether that's hybrid, remote, whatever that operating model is that you have, right? But I think the head of remote will continuously need to adapt to how leadership is thinking about remote work, where they're experiencing the most challenges and how to overcome that, and then continuously improving that experience. How I think about things like an inclusive language guide, although that might fall on a diversity, equity, and inclusion track, many organizations don't necessarily, especially early stage, don't have the privilege or budget to go and hire an expert in DEI, right? But a head of remote can contribute to getting a guideline live on inclusive language in collaboration with people and culture. But that guide isn't going to remain stale or the same. It's going to evolve as the world of DEI evolves, as the world of adding different cultures to the organization is evolving, right? And so that those type of guidelines will continuously evolve and grow with an individual like this and their team.
Amazing. Yeah, indeed. And I would say even if it did fall under like a DEI role, it probably didn't have the remote aspect to it that needed the attention. So even if it's somebody else's role, I would imagine the head of remote contributing like, okay, well, inclusivity remote requires these additional aspects or this form of communication.
Yeah, and if you think about working with people in a 30-kilometer radius office, right? And imagine that company is like, you can work remotely, and they're all in the same sort of 30 kilometers, all working remotely, and now and again, maybe have a hybrid model or a team building, etc. That is a very different remote environment, whereas you're working in a company that's operating out of 75 countries, right, across, I don't know, 18 different time zones. And collectively, there's probably like, I don't know, 32 different languages or maybe more in the organization. The cultural element is there. And every time you add a new country or new culture or new gender to that organization, the demographic is going to keep changing and evolving. And it is going to impact your company culture, right? And so that head of remote will then take that guide and need to create a very different inclusive in remote work element than this 30-kilometer radius office that maybe only has folks from a specific demographic in a specific location. And so I think it's an accessibility element as well for that head of remote, right? What access are they going to have to create in the company to make sure everyone can operate with all the tools that they need, including the language, like the way you communicate with your peers and your colleagues, etc. And so I think it's such a collaborative function. I also don't think it could ever be a function that's siloed, right? The company, the whole organization needs to understand the importance of this function and how they can engage that function in their team, in their department, whatever that department might be doing.
Interesting. I'm curious as to, I mean, my mind immediately goes to all of the return to office mandates. And I guess it's not those companies that we're speaking to because they're not recognizing the importance of putting the remote first processes in place to begin with. So it's really for the forward-leaning companies who already are putting these processes into place and now recognizing that there is actually a role here for all of these processes. Interesting. In terms of like best practices and tools, is there a tool set that you personally use as head of remote in this job function?
I have such a simple answer, and people aren't going to love this, but I always believe start with what you have. Don't overcomplicate it early on. I love starting with the tools that I have access to. So if the company is already providing a documentation tool, optimize it. Figure out how the features work. Figure out how it integrates with other things, right? And optimize the use of that tool. Whether it's Confluence or Notion, or whether you're dogfooding your own product like companies like GitLab are doing to build their handbook, right? That doesn't matter. That matters way less to me. It's about how have you optimized these tools to elevate remote by design or working remotely in this organization. And I think the additional tools and the additional asks and budget for those tools can come later. There's so much you can do with some of these very basic tools to optimize and to start thinking about clever ways to integrate a more fluid experience for someone versus, for example, I need a tool for onboarding and I need a tool for offboarding and I need a tool for my events and I need a tool for L&D. Something GitLab did so well in the early days when I was there, pre-pandemic, right, was, we were dog fooding GitLab, the product for the handbook. And one of the things we were doing prior to that was we had an onboarding process that never lived in the product. And I loved that my job at the time was to create an onboarding, product in the tool. It was to literally use GitLab, the product, as back then, just a host of storing code in a code repository, now a end-to-end DevOps tool with AI. But at that point, it was literally just a place to store code. And so to figure out how to use the product in just doing onboarding was actually not that difficult. But what it did do, it meant every new hire that came into the company was immediately starting to use the product, right? And so it was such a simple idea. It also cost us nothing, right? It cost us nothing to use our own product to build our onboarding plan in a global, remote, distributed environment. And I think from my understanding, GitLab used that tool through IPO. They only switched to an HRIS like Workday. They had a previous HRIS, which they never used for onboarding, but they only switched to Workday a lot later on. But their onboarding last 5-6 years in GitLab through continuous improvement in iteration. So to me, it's not about the tools. You can optimize any AI tool to create a much faster way to do things, absolutely. And there are free ones available. But I would first start with, what tools do you have and how can you optimize those? Slack is obviously an amazing internal communications tool, but it is also quite a social tool. And so the one thing I would be quite hesitant in is to store important information in places like Slack. Because it's a quick chat, asynchronous comms and collaboration tool, if you're starting to store your knowledge and important decisions in places like that, it's going to be really difficult to find it in future. And so as the company scales and grow, it will also be quite difficult to audit that, especially if you add something like some sort of security element where certain things get archived or deleted or changed or whatever the case may be. I don't think Slack is a good tool for storing information and documentation. I think that is an element of remote work that helps people connect globally and distributedly. So a tool like that is necessary, but I think separate what tools you use for that and just focus on elevating that first before you start piling on other tools. I mean, there's many out there.
Yeah, hundreds. It's overwhelming. And indeed, the tool is never the solution. It's more about how it moves our behavior. But it can be changed. It doesn't matter whether it's Slack or Teams or whatever communication tool. Indeed. But I like that you've made the difference between the social or the communication aspect and then the documentation aspect, because one is moving and one is a little bit more static. And so they have different functions. And I can imagine a different tool would be necessary.
Yeah, absolutely. There's something else I would add is I've noticed many companies start with documentation, but there's nearly this hesitancy to add to it. And something I think ahead of remote, like we spoke about Darren earlier, right? I think what Darren did really well at GitLab, back when I still worked there, was Darren never hesitated to get a page live about remote working, whether that was a manager guideline or whatever the case may be. And I don't think it was perfect, right? This is the best part, but the results were being met. We had a guideline for managers, or we had a manifesto about remote work, or we had an inclusive, language guide. And I think something to keep in mind when you have a function like this, or you're about to start as head of remote, it's don't go for perfection and don't take 3 months to implement something. Get your first viable version live by Friday, right? And then iterate on it and make that better. I think having the guideline in place or having the documentation in place is so much more important than having this perfect version that you can present to an external customer, right? I think GitLab did that quite well and taught me how to move away from really, sorry, someone just opened my door. Life, so the joy of having pets and children at home.
Love
so
it.
I think it's
All
very,
welcome.
it's very different in having the tools and having the enablement there than not having it. And I think you nearly want to be a little bit embarrassed with your first version if you've now viewed it after a year, right? I think that ensures that you're moving fast, you're getting the guideline live. It's not going to be perfect. GitLab did that well, even though it was open source. And even if we made a spelling error, anyone at the company could change that spelling error or correct it, right? Because that's how the tool worked. But I do think there's an art of not leaning into perfection when it comes to head of remote work, because chances are whatever you're building today is going to change in 2-3 months or 6-7 months, depending on the pace of the company.
Right. And I can imagine also it's not always the product that's important, but the process of creating the product together with everybody in the organization that sort of, gives you the sealed deal at the end. That process is kind of the thing that you're doing. I love that. I love that. So don't wait. And I know we're reaching the end of the time. Would it be okay if we went just like 3 more minutes?
Absolutely.
I'm not sure what your time suggestions are. Okay. So I'm just curious about one thing. As a head of remote or in this function yourself, where do you go for help with when you need advice on topics? Where do you turn to?
I am so fortunate to be connected to such amazing people around the world. So sometimes I literally ask a question on LinkedIn. I'm a little fearless when it comes to just asking, because I know the importance of asking, right? And the amount of interesting ideas you can get through that. But I also like asking internally. And so regardless of what company I'm working for, sometimes using employee voice for ideas is a very interesting method. So if I need suggestions, ideas, advice, reading through a pulse survey and like double clicking on something to get an idea, even some of the text and what folks write there can help you build a better experience for many people. People are sort of hesitant to use employee voice in the changes they're making, but that's why we ask for surveys. That's why we ask for feedback. So I sometimes actually just run back into survey results, or whether that's candidate experience or new hire or pulse surveys or a bigger engagement survey, is like literally reading what people wrote and using that as ideas. If someone added their name, in some organizations you're able to don't anonymize. Like if you want to, there's an option to anonymize, but there's also an option to be explicit, right? And so for those explicit folks that go, oh, by the way, this is from Toby or this is from Oscar, reach out to Toby, have a coffee chat with them, And I think the other joy of using employee voice in the way you're building for them from a remote working standpoint is shadowing teams, shadowing what they're working on. What are the challenges they're currently solving in their jobs? That does enlighten so much to how are they working remotely? How are they using the guidelines you created or optimizing the tools that's been implemented, right? And whether it's serving them or not. So I think it's that. And then I do belong to an amazing bunch of communities, whether those are people in culture communities or remote working communities. And I find asking questions there the most intriguing and interesting answers. And so you don't need to reinvent the wheel. There's so much information out there. Yeah.
Love it. Love it. And I love the idea of employee voice. Like those are the people we're serving to begin with. So like asking your customers basically is what it comes down to. All right, last question. And this is kind of a big one. So we'll just attack it from whatever angle and as the time that we have. In your first days, and you say, you're coming to a company and it's your first 90 days, right? You're trying to make an impact. Where do you start? What's the first thing you do? I mean, you're being onboarded, but like in terms of implementing your head of remote vision, how do you start?
I think the first thing to establish is to check what's there already, right? Go and figure out what has been documented, what does the company have today, and what is the number one thing they need. So figuring out what is that number one priority, and just focusing on that first. Many of us would have this like amazing 90-day plan that looks completely, fail proof. And let me tell you, in starting, this is now my fourth tech SaaS startup, all of them look very different. All of their priorities are going to be very different than what you perceive from the outside, even during an interview process. I think it's about discovering what is that one priority that the company needs from a head of remote first, and really getting that out and live, and then start focusing on, okay, now let's build a bigger plan. What is that long-term strategy? What are the long-term goals versus the short-term goals? And how do you tie that back to business strategy, business goals, and outcomes? I always love to believe the first thing people are going to need is a guide to asynchronous work, but that's not true, right? In my world, it's been true once or twice, but certainly not at every company. There might be a guide already. There might be another type of manifesto or documentation on how the operating model of the company works. And so I will say, I think it really is company dependent, and it depends on what is the core need and going after that.
Who do you ask about what the number one priority is? Is that like the CEO? Who knows?
Good question. I like collaborating with very scary senior leadership team members. I love booking time with them, sitting with the CEO, but also sitting with his entire leadership team. And what the CEO said might not be consistent to the rest of the leadership team, right? What their needs are might be different. And that then creates this calibration opportunity to feed back to the CEO and say, right, I've established the core priorities being 1, 2, and 3. But one that you mentioned, I didn't pick up from the rest of the leadership team. What do you say about that? How do you feel about that? What is your thinking? And I feel like you first really need to calibrate at that level. If it's a very small company, it's always worth having different groups of people that you're meeting with, from individual contributors, to, I would say, your mid-managers. That's that bond between upper or SLT senior leadership and individual contributors. But there might also be a few individual contributors that's further along in their journey at the company that has a good experience and good insight into what has worked in the past and what has not worked. And then I love asking, so tell me about what's failed in the world of remote work year prior, right? What has happened before I joined? What hasn't worked? And getting a good sense of that first. So yeah, I don't think you should eliminate speaking to anyone, but you also can't speak to everyone. So figuring out those focus groups would go a long way.
Oh, I love that. Indeed, you can't talk with everyone as much as we might want to, depending on the size of the company. So figuring out the focus groups. Oh my goodness, thank you so much, Nadia. And if people want to learn more about you, what is the best place to find you online?
They can connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm never opposed to connecting to new folks. So my link is LinkedIn/Nadia Natalidis. Quite easy to find me. And I'm currently at Camunda. I'm not going to share my email address live. I'm always inundated with beautiful emails, whether that's sales or candidates reaching out. But absolutely connect with me on LinkedIn, and love talking about open source, remote work, and people and culture.
Love it. Thank you so much for your time and your information today. I took copious notes, and I look forward to sharing that with the audience. Thank you so much.
Amazing. Thanks, Lizette. Great to connect.
All right, everybody. Until next time, be powerful.